I have told this story 3 times in my life. Once to my wife on the night we married, once to a magistrate who needed to understand why a man of Dawnmere's standing would involve himself in the settlement of a stranger's debt, and once to my eldest son on the evening before he left for the north, when I wanted him to understand what it looked like when a man of genuine power chose, for the first time in his life, to use it for something that cost him nothing but his pride to admit. My son asked me that night if the Duke of Dawnmere had been in love before he saw her. I told him I did not believe so, not truly. He had been admired, pursued, and courted by half the fashionable houses in England, and he had regarded all of it with the kind of even, undisturbed composure that men mistake for sophistication, and that is, more often, simply the absence of a reason to feel anything at all. That was the man I accompanied to the Clarendon marriage exchange on a Tuesday morning in November, in the 34th year of my life and the 36th of his. I will tell you at the outset that neither of us intended to be there long. Dawnmere had received a letter from a cousin of his, a man named Aldrit Voss, who operated, if operated, is the correct word for a man whose principal occupation was spending money he had not yet managed to borrow in the middling commercial circles of Clarendon. Voss had written to request a brief meeting, business of a financial nature, nothing that need detain the Duke beyond an hour. He was careful not to put too much in the letter. Men who operate as Voss operated generally learn to keep their correspondence brief, on the principle that brevity limits the number of things that can be quoted back at them later. Dawnmere, whose patience for that sort of request was limited but whose sense of obligation to family connections was, as I had learned over the years, more developed than he would ever admit aloud, had agreed to attend. The letter mentioned the exchange only in passing, as a place of convenient central location. It did not mention anything else. I had asked him, in the carriage on the way there, why he had agreed. He was not a man who was generally inclined toward vague meetings on ambiguous business with people whose reliability he had no particular reason to trust. He had considered the question for a moment and said, with the simplicity that was his most characteristic form of honesty, "He is the only surviving connection on my mother's side. She would have expected it." He looked out the window. She had a high regard for family obligation. I disagreed with her on most subjects, and she was right more often than I was willing to admit, so I have adopted the practice of acting on her positions when they are clearly stated, as a form of ongoing correction. He paused. She would have told me to go. I did not say anything. After a moment he added, she was generally correct about these things, and then he went back to his papers. This was, I thought, the truest and most useful thing I had ever heard him say about why he did anything. The Clarendon marriage exchange was housed in a building that had once been a grain merchant's warehouse, which told you a great deal about the society that now used it. It had been paneled and carpeted and fitted with chandeliers, but the bones of the place remained what they were, broad and functional, and designed for the efficient movement of goods. They had laid a runner of burgundy carpet down the central aisle and installed benches on either side, so that the whole of it had a vaguely ecclesiastical quality, which struck me as appropriate in the way that certain ironies are appropriate, which is to say not at all pleasant. The men who gathered there on a Tuesday in November were merchants, minor landholders, the occasional impoverished baronet, and a handful of solicitors who served as intermediaries between families with daughters they wished to settle and gentlemen with sufficient capital to be worth settling them upon. There was nothing illegal about it. There rarely is, with cruelty dressed in the right clothing. Dawnmere walked in and the room noticed. It always did. He was not a man who could be overlooked, not merely for his height or his bearing, though he had both in abundance, but because of something in the quality of his attention. When Crispin Aldrit, the Duke of Dawnmere, looked at something, it did not feel like casual regard. It felt like assessment, and the thing being assessed always seemed to understand this, whether it was a business proposal, a piece of horseflesh, or a room full of men who had just realized they were in the presence of someone a great deal more significant than they had expected. Conversations quieted. Men straightened. One solicitor near the door actually put down his papers and did not pick them up again for several minutes. Aldrit Voss found us within minutes, which told me he had been watching the door. He was a compact man with good boots and an anxious quality about the eyes that I associated with men who had borrowed more than they could ever repay and spent their lives waiting for the arithmetic to catch them. He had the manner of someone who had rehearsed a conversation a great many times on the carriage ride over and was now discovering that the live version felt different. He greeted Dawnmere with the particular warmth that people reserve for those whose goodwill they urgently require. "Your Grace," he said, and the gratitude in it was almost painful. "I'm relieved you came. I wanted to speak with you before the morning's proceedings, since it touches on a matter of some delicacy." "Speak plainly," Dawnmere said. It was not unkind. It was simply how he spoke. Voss spoke plainly. He explained, incurred certain obligations in the course of managing his late brother's estate. Miriam's father, I understood later, a man who had died some 18 months before, leaving a tangle of debts and a daughter and very little else. And Voss had been appointed, by a will he had perhaps had some hand in drafting, to administer the whole of it. Those obligations had become, over time, rather acute. He had come into the guardianship of his brother's daughter, who was, he said, a pleasant enough young woman, quite accomplished in the usual ways. She had a fine hand at correspondence, could manage household accounts, and spoke adequately if not brilliantly in French. She would not, he supposed, be entirely without appeal to the right sort of buyer. He had arranged for her to be presented that morning under the standard exchange terms. He was hopeful of a clean settlement. He had debts to discharge. He said all of this to Dawnmere the way you might explain the disposal of a piece of furniture you had inherited and had no room for. I watched Dawnmere's face during this recitation. Nothing moved in it. His expression remained exactly what it had been when we entered, calm, attentive, giving away nothing at all. Only his right hand, which rested at his side, shifted very slightly, one finger drawing a short line against the seam of his coat, the way it did when something had arrested his attention completely. "When is she to be presented?" he asked. "Second lot," Voss said, "after the Henley girl. Perhaps half an hour." "We will wait," Dawnmere said. Voss blinked. He had not expected this. "There is a refreshment room at the rear if you'd prefer." "We will wait here." I did not ask him why. I had learned over the years of our friendship that Dawnmere's silences were not vacancies. They were rooms with things in them that he had not yet decided to share. The first lot was presented and disposed of with brisk efficiency. A girl of perhaps 17 was brought out and stood in the center of the room, while a man with a ledger read out her attributes in the flat, a numerated way of someone who has read many such lists and expects to read many more, her family connections, her reported accomplishments, the amount of her father's debts that the successful bidder would be expected to discharge as part of the arrangement. She stood with her eyes on the floor for the duration of it. A man in the second row bid without looking up from his gloves. No one else entered. The gavel came down. The girl was led away by the exchange attendant. A female relative who had been sitting in the corner. Her mother, I thought, from the resemblance, though she had the exhausted bearing of a woman who has long since spent all her available objections and is now simply enduring, rose and followed without speaking to anyone. The whole of it took perhaps 12 minutes. Dawnmere watched all of this without expression. I watched him. There was something particular about the way Dawnmere watched things he found intolerable. He did not look away, which some people do, which is an understandable response to things that are wrong and which I have always thought is, regardless of its intention, a form of permission. He kept his gaze on it. He attended to it. He let himself understand what was in front of him, with the same completeness he brought to understanding anything. What he did with that understanding afterward was different in each case, but the understanding itself was always complete and always honest. I had known him long enough to see this in him and to consider it one of the few genuinely admirable things about his character, and his character, on balance, contained a number of admirable things. The second lot was announced. Miriam Voss was brought in from a side door. I want to be precise about what I saw because I have replayed it many times since. She was not remarkable in the way the exchange typically prized. Her gown was a pale gray that had been carefully maintained, but was several seasons behind what the wealthier families in the room were wearing. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with dark hair dressed simply, and a face that was, I have thought about this word many times since, tried to replace it with something more accurate, and always come back to it composed. Not the blankness of someone suppressing feeling, which I have also seen, and which has a held, effortful quality to it. Not the brittle surface of someone who has told themselves they will not break and is concentrating very hard on keeping that promise. This was something different, something quieter and more settled. The composure of someone who had looked clearly at the situation she was in, had looked at it without flinching, understood its dimensions and its cruelties, and had decided, with whatever internal resources were available to her, that she would not let it define her, that it was a chapter, not the whole of the story. She walked to the center of the room without hurrying. She did not look at the floor. She did not look at the ceiling. She looked without aggression and without appeal at the middle distance, the particular gaze of a person who has decided that their worth is not going to be determined by the assessments of the people currently assessing them, and who is prepared to wait until the world catches up to that fact. The man with the ledger began to read. It was at this point that Aldrich Voss, who had stationed himself at the edge of the room with the self-satisfied air of a man who has arranged something profitable, said, not quietly, because men like Aldrich Voss never said things like this quietly, "Sell her to whoever will have her. I want the debts cleared and the matter done." He said it the way you might say it about a coat. The room did not quite react. It was that sort of room. But I felt something change in the air beside me, and I turned to look at Dawnmere, and what I saw in his face then was the specific expression of a man who has just made a decision. Not the kind you make about where to take your dinner, but the kind you make when some line has been crossed that you cannot uncross, and the only remaining question is what you intend to do about it. The bidding opened. A man near the front offered a modest figure. Another, further back, offered slightly more. Voss nodded along with each bid like a man watching a race in which he had placed a stake. Miriam stood in the center of the room and did not look at any of them. She looked at that same middle distance, and there was in her face now something I have only seen a handful of times in my life, the particular courage of a person who is being treated as less than they are, and who refuses with every controlled muscle of their bearing to confirm the assessment. She would not bow her head. She would not show them fear. She simply stood there in her careful gray gown and was herself and waited. Dawnmere moved. He stepped forward, not rushing, not making a performance of it, simply moving with the deliberate intention he brought to everything he decided to do. The room noticed, this time with a different quality of noticing. The noticing of people who have been watching one kind of proceedings and have suddenly understood that a different kind has begun. He named a figure. It was more than twice what the previous bid had been. He named it in the same quiet tone he used to conclude negotiations, without drama, with the absolute authority of a man to whom the amount was not a consideration worth noticing, and who wished that fact to be understood without further discussion. The silence that followed was of the particular quality that descends when a situation has changed completely, and the people in it have not yet had time to arrange their expressions accordingly. Miriam turned her head and looked at him. I had expected surprise, perhaps the beginnings of practiced gratitude. What I saw instead was assessment, the same quality of attention he had brought into the room, now directed back at him with the same unhurried thoroughness. She was looking at him the way you look at something you have never encountered before and are not yet certain how to read, and intend to read accurately before you respond. Dawnmere met her gaze and kept it. The gavel came down. The matter, as Aldrich Voss had wished it, was done. Something moved in Dawnmere's face in the moment the gavel fell, when Miriam was still looking at him. I did not have a name for it then. I think I understand it better now. It was the expression of a man who has done something for what he believed was one reason, and has discovered in the moment of doing it that there was another reason underneath the first, and that the second reason was rather more significant than he had known. He had come forward, I believe, because of the quality of her composure, because a woman with that quality of courage did not deserve to be sold like furniture by a man who referred to her as a matter to be done. He had come forward out of decency, the bedrock, unflashy, unannounced kind that does not require an audience. He had recognized something in her that the room had failed to recognize, and his response to that recognition was automatic, the way your hand reaches out when you see something falling. But the other reason, the one underneath, that one he would not name for some time yet, and neither watching him watch her would I name it for him. The exchange of documentation took approximately an hour. Aldrich Voss settled the papers with the haste of someone grateful to be leaving a room that had become more complicated than he had planned, accepted the bank draft, and made his exit. Miriam sat in a chair along the wall of the anteroom and waited. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and her face set in the same composed expression she had maintained throughout, And there was about her now, in the quieter space, something I could observe more clearly, a quality of watchfulness, the stillness of someone who is cataloging everything around them very carefully and drawing their own conclusions. When Dawnmere turned to her, the solicitors having concluded their portion, he said directly, "You are under no obligation to accompany me. If there is someone else you would prefer to send word to, a friend, a relation of your father's household, that can be arranged." She looked at him for a long moment. "Is there an alternative arrangement you would suggest, Your Grace?" He was quiet. "No." "Then I will accompany you," she said, and stood, and that was the whole of the conversation. I rode behind them in the second carriage. Dawnmere Hall was 3 hours from Clarendon, through a November landscape of austere beauty. The park was extensive, the house large in the way of houses added to across several generations by men who had different ideas about what a house ought to express. The overall impression was of power that had accumulated rather than been designed, of rooms made serious by use, of a place that knew what it was without needing to announce it. I stayed for 3 weeks. I had no official role in the household. I was a friend, which in the language of Dawnmere's life translated to the one person permitted to observe things clearly and say what he saw. Our friendship had begun when we were both 17, before the title and all its machinery, and I had the particular freedom of a man who has seen someone at their worst and decided to remain anyway. In those 3 weeks, I watched Crispin Aldrich manage the situation of Miriam Voss's presence in his household with a combination of scrupulous correctness and increasing, barely perceptible agitation. He explained to me on the first evening, arranged for her to be housed in the East Wing with proper accommodation and a lady's companion. She would be treated as a guest. He had already begun looking into the matter of her father's estate, and was considering what appropriate longer-term situation might be arranged. Longer-term situation, I repeated. A respectable household where she might serve as a companion, perhaps, or some means of independent settlement if the estate proves to have anything salvageable. He was looking at the fire when he said this, with the expression of a man who is thinking about something other than what he is saying and is aware of the fact. "Have you spoken with her?" "I have informed her of the arrangements." "That isn't what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. "She is not easy to speak with in a general way," he said slowly, as if working out the sentence as he went. "She says precisely what she means. She does not produce the expected responses." I waited. When I told her the East Wing was at her disposal, and she was welcome to treat it as her own for the duration, she thanked me and asked what was expected of her in the arrangement. I told her nothing was expected. She said she did not believe that to be entirely accurate, and that she would prefer to know what I actually wanted from the situation, so that she could determine whether she was able to provide it honestly. "And what did you say?" I told her I wanted nothing. He paused. She said that was unlikely to be true, and that she would wait until I had thought it through more carefully. I did not say anything. I did not need to. She had been right, of course. The Duke of Dawnmere wanted a great many things, and most of them were things he had long since taught himself not to reach for, on the sound reasoning that a man in his position reaches for things and receives them. And what he had never managed to find was the thing he actually wanted. Not a thing at all, but a quality of being in a room with someone who saw you clearly, and was neither afraid of what they saw nor inclined to use it. He had decided somewhere in his middle 20s that this was simply not available to a man of his rank and reputation, and had arranged his life accordingly. He had not counted on a woman who asked direct questions in the East Wing of his house. On the 4th day of my stay, I walked into the library in the late afternoon to find both of them there. Dawnmere was at his usual desk by the window, working through correspondence. Miriam was in the chair near the south bookcase that nobody ordinarily used because the light was poor, reading something from the upper shelf that I would later discover was a treatise on land tenure law dated 1798. She had her feet tucked up beneath her in the manner of someone who has been in the chair long enough to have stopped thinking of themselves as a guest. Neither of them looked up when I came in. I sat near the fireplace and held a book open and listened. There was no conversation. They were both reading, and the silence between them was not the carefully managed silence of two people who are aware of each other and performing ease. It was the quieter, less effortful silence of two people who have each concluded that the other's presence does not require management and have arrived at this conclusion at roughly the same time. I had sat in many silences with Dawnmere across the years. This one was different. This one had a texture, the specific density of two people who have decided, independently, that the other is someone they are prepared to simply be in a room with. After perhaps 20 minutes, without looking up from the treatise, Miriam said, "Your Grace, this document from 1798 suggests that the enclosure of common land on a leased estate requires a separate parliamentary act even where the leaseholder holds what appears to be full title. Is that still the current understanding, or has it been modified?" Dawnmere looked up from his correspondence with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not surprise, it was something closer to recalibration, the face of someone who had an accurate model of the situation and has just discovered one of its assumptions needs adjusting. "Where did you find that document?" he said. "Third shelf, south case. Your librarian has the organization backwards. The older materials are at eye level and the current legislation is at the top, which means anyone looking up current practice has to scale the shelves to find it. It seems like an easy thing to correct." "I'll speak with him," Dawnmere said slowly, as if translating something from a language he was still learning. "The 1798 question," she said, turning a page. "The current understanding is more complex," he said, setting aside his correspondence. "It depends on the nature of the common rights and whether they were formally recorded before the lease was drawn. The relevant acts over the last 30 years have produced inconsistent jurisprudence on the point. Do you have an interest in a particular situation?" "My father's estate," she said, still reading. "My uncle told me the arrangement was irrecoverable, but he told me a great many things that turned out not to be strictly accurate, and I thought it was worth verifying from primary sources before accepting his conclusions." There was a silence of perhaps 5 seconds. "I have my own legal advisors looking into that question," Dawnmere said carefully. She looked up. "I know. I overheard you speaking with Mr. Castle on Tuesday. I didn't come forward then because it wasn't the right moment, but I thought you should know I'm aware of it, and that I would prefer to be consulted on questions relating to my father's estate, rather than simply informed of the outcome once a conclusion has been reached." She held his gaze with the steady, measuring attention I had seen in the exchange. "I understand if that's not how you prefer to operate." Another silence. "It is not typically how I operate," Dawnmere said. "No," she agreed, and something that was not quite a smile, the private, slight expression of someone who has said an accurate thing, moved across her face. "I imagine not," and she turned back to the treatise. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at me. I looked at my book with great attention. That evening, after Miriam had excused herself, Dawnmere poured 2 glasses of port and said, without preamble, "She is the most direct person I have met in 36 years. "Yes," I said. "Most people spend a great deal of energy telling me what they believe I wish to hear." "Most people do." "She appears to have no interest in that whatsoever." "None that I've observed." He was quiet, looking at his glass. "I find it clarifying," he said, as if the word cost him something to produce, as if he had tried several alternatives and discarded them. "To be spoken to in a straight line, without management." I thought about saying something, then I chose not to. Some things want more time before you put words to them. The days continued. I settled into a rhythm of the house I had not expected and found very comfortable, mornings in the park or library, afternoons attending to estate business with Dawnmere, evenings with the particular quality of conversation that I have always found to be the best thing about his company, now that we were old enough to have things worth discussing. Miriam walked in the park each morning in the brisk and purposeful way of someone who walks to think rather than to be seen walking. I joined her twice. She was not a woman who required conversation to be comfortable with someone's presence, and when she did speak it, was with a directness and intelligence that I had previously associated mainly with Dawnmere himself, though in her the quality had a different flavor. Where his directness had been shaped by decades of being listened to, hers had been shaped by years of not being listened to at all, which made it quieter and perhaps more certain of itself. She had views on everything she had been reading: land tenure law, the administration of estates, the inconsistencies in English inheritance practice as it pertained to women in circumstances like her own. And she explained them with the methodical patience of someone who has worked things out alone, without the benefit of a teacher, and is consequently very sure of every step. On one of those walks, she told me she had been conducting a careful legal investigation into her father's estate, using the library's collection of statutes and the relevant acts of Parliament, which she had located through a system of her own devising after she established that the librarian's organizational logic was, as she put it, entirely backwards. Not for any particular outcome, she was careful to say. Simply because she intended to understand what had actually happened to what her father had left, and whether her uncle's account of the situation bore any relationship to reality. She told me all of this without asking for sympathy or for anything at all. She was simply being accurate about what she was doing. She said she had found very early in her life that the things that could be verified ought to be verified, and the things that could not ought to be set aside without emotion, and that this approach had generally served her better than the alternative. I asked her on the second walk what had sustained her at the exchange, how she had stood there in the center of that room and maintained what she had maintained. She was quiet for a moment in the park's cold air. I decided, she said, that what happened in that room was not about me. It was about what the room was and what my uncle was. None of it was a measure of what I am. And since it wasn't a measure of what I am, it couldn't diminish me, and there was no point in behaving as if it could. She said it the way she said most things, simply, without performing the sentiment, as if it were simply an accurate description of a decision she had made. I thought about this for a long time afterward. I think about it still. On a rainy afternoon during the second week, I happened to pass the library door and heard voices, not the voices of a serious exchange, but something lighter and less guarded. Dawnmere's low voice making an observation about a document, Miriam's responding with a brisk correction, and then his response to the correction. A pause, and something I had not heard in his voice in years, which was the sound of a man who has been amused not because the situation is funny, but because the person who has just corrected him has done it with such complete precision that the only honest response is amusement. A silence followed that had warmth in it, the particular warmth of two people who have just established, without announcing it, that they are capable of this. I did not go in. Some things deserve privacy even when you are simply passing a door. On the morning of the 8th day, I came down early to find the breakfast room already occupied. Dawnmere was at the far end of the table with a newspaper and a cup of coffee, and Miriam was at the near end with one of the land tenure volumes propped against the teapot, and a plate she had barely touched. Neither of them looked up when I came in. Neither of them had spoken, as far as I could tell, in some time. The fire was high, and the room was warm, and the two of them sat in the comfortable quiet of people who have been in each other's presence long enough for the other's silence to feel like company. I poured coffee and sat down and took a piece of toast and did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. After a minute or so, Miriam said, without looking up from her book, "Your Grace, did you intend to have the East Meadow drainage looked at before the hard frost, or after?" Dawnmere put down his newspaper. He had the expression of someone who has been reminded of something they had been meaning to address and is not annoyed to be reminded of it. "Before," he said. "I'll send word to Hartley this morning." "The second drainage trench is worse than the first," she said. "I walked that way on Tuesday. If it freezes in its current state, you'll lose the early planting along the east boundary." A silence. "You walked the East Meadow," he said, not as a question. "I wanted to see the estate," she said. "I hope that was—" She glanced up briefly. "I assumed it was acceptable." "It is entirely acceptable," he said, with the particular evenness of a man who is carefully not making too much of something. "Thank you for the information about the drainage." "I'll write down what I noticed if that would be useful," she said, turning a page. "It would," he said. He did not go back to his newspaper after that. He sat with his coffee and looked at some point between the window and the table, and I recognized the expression, because I had seen it in various forms across many years. The look of a man who is assembling accurate information about a situation and is only now beginning to understand the scale of what the situation is. I took another piece of toast and did not say anything. On a rainy afternoon during the second week, I found Dawnmere in the study going over a correspondence that he set aside when I came in with the air of a man who had not been entirely absorbed in what he was reading. "She asked me this morning," he said without preamble, "whether I intended to contest the Aldenmere boundary claim before the winter sessions or wait for the spring." "Did she?" I said. She had read the relevant correspondence in the library. I had left it in the filing, which she appears to regard the library as a general research resource rather than a restricted collection. Is that a problem? He was quiet. No, he said. She also found an error in the boundary survey from 1809 that my father's solicitors had apparently missed, and that would, if the Dawnmere family cited that survey in their claim, undermine the entire basis of their argument. He paused. She had written a very brief note about it, which she left on the relevant file. It said, "I believe there is an error in the 1809 survey that may be relevant to your current dispute. I thought you should have it. M.V." I looked at him. She signs her initials, he said, on notes, as if she has always been here, as if she has always had standing to leave notes on my files. Another pause. I find I do not object to this. No, I said. I can see that. He looked at me with the expression of a man who is on the edge of saying something true and is determining whether the moment has arrived for it. Castle, he said, I have spent 36 years being very good at a great many things, and I have very little experience of being in company with someone who is also very good at things. Real things, substantive things, not the management of drawing rooms or the performance of fashionable opinions, but he stopped. But I said, but the kind of things that matter, he said, the kind of things I spend my time on, the kind of things I actually care about. He was looking at the file with the note on it. She thinks about the same things I think about. She thinks about them differently. I find that I want to know how she arrived at her conclusions. I want to know what she sees when she looks at the same problem I'm looking at. That seems like a significant thing, I said. It is a significant thing, he said quietly. Yes. On the afternoon of the 9th day, I came into the library to find it empty except for Dawnmere, who was standing at the south window looking out at the park. She's walking, he said without turning around. I can see that. He was quiet. Then, she found an irregularity in the Voss estate documents. The deed of administration was improperly witnessed, only one signature where the law requires two, and the second signature appears on close examination to have been made by the same hand as the first. He paused. She presented it to me this morning with a note that said, I am quoting precisely, I believe this may constitute fraud. I thought you should have this before your advisors complete their assessment, in case it affects their conclusions. That's rather significant, I said. It is extremely significant. My advisors, who have been working on this question for 9 days, had not found it. He turned from the window. She found it in 3 days, reading alone in a chair with poor light. He said this last part in the tone of a man who has been genuinely, uncomplicatedly impressed by something, and is only mildly irritated at himself for the degree of it. You might tell her that, I said. I did, he said, and something in his voice had shifted. I told her it was remarkable work. She said that it was only what anyone would have done if they had decided that the situation was not going to remain what it presently was. She said she had found very early in her life that no situation is as immovable as it initially presents itself to be, and that this was generally more useful to understand than the details of any particular situation. He looked at me, I looked at him. Castle, he said. Yes. I am experiencing some difficulty with, he stopped. He was not ordinarily a man who stopped in the middle of sentences. I know, I said. I am not entirely certain what to. I know, I said. He turned back to the window. She was just visible at the far end of the south walk, moving at her usual purposeful pace, her dark coat distinct against the winter-pale grasses. I don't know what to do with this, he said very quietly. I am accustomed to knowing what to do with things. I suspect, I said, that she would be in favor of doing something direct and honest about it, whatever it is. He didn't answer, but he kept looking out the window for a long time. The days that followed had a particular quality, the quality of a situation that has reached the edge of what it was and is waiting to become what it will be. I have never seen Dawnmere uncertain before or since, not in any matter of consequence. He was uncertain now. Not paralyzed by it, not made useless by it, but genuinely, quietly uncertain, the way a man is when he cares what the answer will be and cannot yet see it. It expressed itself in small ways. He was more careful than usual in conversation at dinner, choosing his words with the additional attention of someone who knows that the person listening is attending to what he says with real precision and will think about it afterward, and who finds, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he does not wish to be imprecise. He went to the library more often than was strictly necessary for the business of the estate. On 2 occasions, I came in to find him in the chair with poor Light, Miriam's chair, which I thought he had claimed without being aware of claiming it, reading whatever she had left there, which was always something that a reasonable person would have needed a reason to find interesting, but which he was evidently finding interesting. On the 11th evening after dinner, I was in the sitting room with my port when Miriam came to return a book to the small shelf near the fire. She had been borrowing from it during the evenings, a habit she had established quietly and without asking, which was also her way, and she paused before she left and said, with the deliberateness of someone who has decided to say something they have been considering, "Mr. Castle, you have known the Duke for a great many years." "Since we were 17, I said. "Does he generally," she paused, finding the word with the care she brought to precision, "does he generally speak to people the way he speaks to me, the same way?" I thought about this seriously because it deserved serious thought. "No," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I see," she said, and then, "Thank you," and she went out. On the 12th day, I was walking along the East Gallery when I heard them in the adjoining room, the estate office, the room where Dawnmere worked through the practical machinery of the hall's management. The door was not quite closed. I heard his voice, very low, reading something from a document and her voice responding, and then a silence, and then his voice again, slower, with the particular quality of someone who is working through a problem in conversation, and has found, somewhat to their surprise, that the conversation is making the working through better. I walked past without slowing, but I smiled in the gallery where nobody could see. On the 13th afternoon, I came across Miriam in the rose garden, bare in November, but she was walking along the paths with her hands behind her back, and the focused, internal expression of someone working through a problem. She noticed me and came over, and we walked for a while in the comfortable silence I had come to understand was her form of easy company. After a time she said, "He told me this morning that the work I did on the estate documents that it was well done." She said it without vanity and without false modesty, as a simple fact. He said it with some precision, which I appreciated. Most people, when they say something is well done, mean that they are surprised it is not worse. "He meant it," I said. "Yes," she said, "I know he did." Another pause. "That was the first time in a considerable while that anyone has said something like that to me and meant it." She said this with the same even tone she brought to everything without self-pity as a straightforward observation. It was notable. I did not say anything. After a moment she said, "I suppose what I mean to say is that I understand why you are his friend. He says what he means, even when what he means is something good." "He does," I said. She nodded, as if confirming something to herself, and we walked on in the silence that was her particular form of warmth. I observed across those days a number of small things that I believe accumulated into something that can only be described as the slow recognition of 2 people, that the other one is essential. A morning when I came down early and found them already in the breakfast room, both reading, with the ease of people who have been in each other's company long enough for it to feel like the right arrangement, and neither of them noticed that they had arrived at the same conclusion about where to spend the first hour of the day. An evening when Miriam offered an observation on the management of the home farm that Dawnmere's steward had been muddling for 3 years, sharp and accurate in 3 sentences, and Dawnmere looked at her across the table with an expression that was not surprise, but something more like recognition. The face of a man seeing a thing clearly that he had already half known. A moment in the library when he passed her a book without being asked, one he had determined she would want based on the direction of her investigations, and she received it without thanking him, which was its own kind of acknowledgement, the acknowledgement of someone who has been seen accurately enough that the gesture needs no ceremony. I catalogued all of this privately and said nothing. It was not my story to tell, and in any case the 2 of them were doing well enough at telling it themselves, in the only vocabulary available to them, books and notes and observations about drainage, and the slow, mutual establishment of the fact that the other person was someone you were comfortable existing near. I had known Dawnmere for 36 years, and had never seen him manage this particular process, because I had never seen him want to. It was not graceful, he was uncertain, and the uncertainty showed, and he did not know quite what to do with the showing of it. But it was real, and she saw it, and she met it with the same steady, accurate attention she brought to everything. I think looking back that this was what made it work, not that he was certain. Not that he was perfect, but that she saw him clearly, the whole of him, the uncertainty and the guardedness and the code underneath, and was not put off by any of it, and that he saw her with the same clarity, and that neither of them was required to perform, for the other, anything other than what they actually were. On the 15th day, Aldrich Voss arrived. He had not written. He simply appeared at the front entrance at 11:30, with the air of a man who has been working himself up to something and has arrived before he could think better of it. He was brought in, and I happened to be in the hall when he was shown through it. Miriam was crossing from the library direction with books under her arm, and she stopped when she saw him with the focused, immediate attentiveness of someone who has been expecting precisely this. Nothing in her expression became frightened. She looked at him, and what she saw appeared to confirm some prior assessment she had already made and was entirely prepared for. "Miss Voss," Voss said, producing the warmth of a man who knows he has no right to expect any. "I'm glad to find you well." "Thank you, uncle," she said steadily. "I believe the Duke's secretary will attend to you. Good afternoon." And she went on up the stair. She did not hurry, she did not look back. Voss's errand, as he explained it to Dawnmere in the formal study. I stood at the back of the room, which the Duke had indicated with the smallest possible gesture was what he preferred, was in its essence a renegotiation. The arrangement at the exchange, he said, had been made somewhat hastily and under conditions that had not permitted a full accounting of all the relevant interests. There were, he believed, certain ongoing considerations pertaining to his niece's welfare that had not been properly addressed in the original documentation. His own interests as her guardian, his natural concern for her well-being, the emotional weight of the matter, the sacrifice involved in releasing a girl he had, after all, raised, however complicated the circumstances. He said this last part with the particular audacity of a man who has found that audacity has worked before. Certain understandings might be formalized, he thought, between men of the world, men of substance, men who understood these things and could be relied upon to handle them as gentlemen. He said all of this with the air of a man making a reasonable proposal, one businessman to another. Dawnmere listened to the whole of it without moving. When Voss had finished, there was a silence of perhaps 10 seconds, which is a very long time when the person maintaining the silence is Crispin Aldrich and you are Aldrich Voss, and you have just finished saying what you have just said. "I want to be certain I understand you correctly," Dawnmere said. His voice was entirely even. "You are proposing that I make ongoing financial arrangements with you in exchange for your continued cooperation with an arrangement that you have already signed, formally concluded, and been paid for in full." Voss began to make a gesture intended to soften the framing. He was good at gestures of that kind. He had spent a lifetime developing them. "I am also advised," Dawnmere continued in the same measured tone, as if the gesture had not occurred, "by my legal representatives and by Miss Voss herself, that the deed of administration you hold in respect of the late Mr. Voss's estate was improperly witnessed. That the document contains only one valid witness signature where the law requires two, and that the second signature is consistent, on close examination, with having been produced by the same hand as the first." He let that settle in the room. "I have transmitted this evidence to the appropriate legal parties. The matter is now with the relevant authorities. You will be receiving formal communication in the coming days." He looked at Voss with the complete, unhurried attention he brought to everything, the attention that had made him, across 3 decades, the man that men did not want to find on the other side of a negotiation, because it left no room for anything that was not exactly what it was. "Is there anything else you wish to discuss?" Voss's face moved through several rapid stages of expression, the calculation of a man who is quickly running new numbers, the alarm of a man who finds the numbers running badly, the rapid reassessment of someone who has walked into a situation he did not understand and is now understanding it at a speed he had not planned for. "I see," he said at last, in the depleted voice of someone who has run out of room and out of options and knows it. "Good," said Dawnmere. "My secretary will arrange for your carriage." He turned away, the way he turned away from concluded things, with the same decisive completeness he brought to everything. The subject was done. Voss was shown out by the secretary, with a speed and efficiency that suggested the secretary had been briefed and was not displeased to perform this particular function. He left, the door closed. I looked at Dawnmere. He was standing quite still in the center of the room, and what was in his face now was something I can only describe as relief. The particular, quiet kind that arrives when you have defended something that mattered to you and the defense held, and the thing is still there on the other side of it. "She found that," he said after a moment, "with a candle and 3 days and a borrowed book. She found the thing his document could not withstand, and she put it in my hands without making anything of the gesture." "Yes," I said. "She didn't ask me to act on it. She didn't ask me for anything. She simply gave me what she had found and let me decide what to do with it." "That's her manner," I said. "I know," he said, and then quieter, with the quality of a man saying something true that he has only recently understood. "I know." He was quiet for a while. Then he moved to the south window, it was becoming a habit, that window, and stood with his hands behind his back and said, without turning around, "Castle, how long would it take to arrange things properly, formally, without rushing the matter or treating the situation as anything other than what it ought to be?" I thought about this with the care it deserved. 6 weeks, perhaps, if your legal people move efficiently and the estate matter resolves as expected. There would be documents to arrange, settlements to put in order. 6 weeks, he said. "For the formal settlement of the estate," I said carefully. "The financial arrangements." He turned from the window and looked at me directly. "Yes," he said, "I understand what you mean." It was not 6 weeks. It was 5 days, because Dawnmere, when he decided to do something, did not believe in introducing unnecessary delay. On the 5th day after Voss's departure, the November light at its flat and perfect best, and the park sharp in the cold before noon, he asked Miriam to walk with him in the south garden. I watched from the library window. I will not pretend otherwise. I had placed myself at the window on the pretext of checking the state of the South Walk's drainage, which was not a pretext I had great confidence in, but which I employed anyway. They walked for a long time. He spoke at some length, unusual for him, a man who had always trusted compression over elaboration on matters he considered important, who had built his reputation partly on the quality of what he didn't say. But he seemed to understand that this was different, that the compression which served him in other circumstances was exactly what would fail him here, and he spoke accordingly. I could not hear the words from the window, only the rhythm of it, the longer passages of his voice and the shorter responses of hers, and then a period where she spoke at some length and he listened, with the attentiveness I had watched him bring to everything she said since the 4th day. What she said to him at length I did not know until she told me much later. What I saw from the window was the response. A brief, very still pause of the kind that means you have heard something unexpected and are deciding not how to answer it, but how to receive it, how to let it change the shape of what you understood. Then something settled in his bearing, a specific kind of ease entering it from the inside out, the ease that comes when someone has said something simply and completely true, and the truth of it fits exactly the space you had been holding open for it, the space you had not known you were holding open, the space that had been there all along. He held out his hand, not the extended hand of the exchange, with its public authority and its message to a watching room, not the hand of a man asserting a right or fulfilling an obligation or making a declaration for the benefit of witnesses. The hand of a man in a garden in the November light, offering something he is not certain he has any business offering it anyway, because he has decided, after 36 years of knowing what to do with everything, to do the uncertain thing, and who genuinely, without performance, wants to know whether it will be received. She looked at it. She was quiet for perhaps 3 seconds, which were, from the window, very long seconds. She looked at him. She put her hand in his. They walked on together down the south walk, her hand in his, moving at the same purposeful pace she always walked, and he matched it exactly, and the two of them went on down the path together in the thin, clear November light. And I set my book down on the windowsill and turned to look at the fire instead, because some things are not mine to watch, and some things deserve, at their moment of completion, to belong entirely to the people they are happening to. She told me much later, after they had been married 2 years, and she had decided I was worth being as honest with as she was with anyone, what he had said to her in the garden, and what she had said in return. He had told her, she said, that he had begun this badly, that the room where it had begun was a room full of people who had treated her as something to be disposed of, and that in stepping forward as he had, however the intent behind it, he had done so without asking her first, had substituted his own judgment for the judgment she had a right to make about her own situation, and that this was a different form of the same error in a more presentable suit of clothing. He was sorry for it. He had said this plainly, without asking her to relieve him of the discomfort of having said it, simply stated it as accurate and let it stand. He had told her that he had spent the previous 15 days in a state of, and here she paused, with the slight, precise expression that meant she was about to quote something exactly, considerable recalibration, which was, she told me, the most carefully chosen piece of understatement she had ever heard in her life, and by which she had immediately understood that he meant that he had been thinking about her most of the time and had found the experience deeply unsettling and had, on reflection, not particularly wished to stop. He had told her that he had not had a reason to want things in a long time, not things of consequence, not things that involved allowing someone else to see the wanting. He had told her that he found himself wanting things now, the specific and unflashy things that he had not known he needed until they had been present for 2 weeks, and he had begun to understand that his days were oriented around them, though he had not admitted this until the 9th day at the window. A conversation tomorrow, he had told her, and the day after that. The particular knowledge of how she had arrived at a conclusion he was still working toward. The state of being in a room with someone who did not require him to present a managed version of himself, who would notice if he did and would say so, probably in the direct and accurate way she said everything, and that the noticing would not be hostile and would not be aimed at him, would simply be accurate. He had told her that he had not known this was something he wanted because he had not had any evidence it was available, and that this was perhaps an indictment of the previous 15 years of his life, but was in any case where he found himself now. He had told her he had decided, since she had made it clear at the outset that she preferred directness, to be direct about all of this, and then to wait and see what she said. She had told him, she said, that she found it interesting that he thought directness required the kind of preparation he had evidently given it. She had told him that she had come to Dawnmere Hall expecting nothing, that this was not self-pity, simply the accurate assessment of a woman who had learned to calibrate her expectations to the evidence available, and had found instead a house full of books, a library whose organization she had already corrected in her own notes, even though it was not her library, and a man who said what he meant, who attended to things that actually mattered with the same care he gave to things that conventionally were supposed to matter, and who had not at any point in 15 days treated her as anything other than a person whose thoughts about things were worth attending to. She had told him she had decided some time ago, earlier, she acknowledged, than she was perhaps quite ready to admit, but she was ready to admit it now, that she would rather stay at Dawnmere Hall than leave it, and that she had not known how to say this without it sounding like gratitude, which was not what it was. He had asked, what was it if not gratitude? She had said it was preference. She had looked at the whole situation accurately, and she preferred him. She would like to go on preferring him if that was agreeable to them both. And then she told me, with the dry, light precision that was her most particular form of warmth, the form she reserved for things she found genuinely delightful, that at this point, Crispin Aldrich, the Duke of Dawnmere, who was regarded across 3 counties and 2 city financial exchanges as the most composed man in England, had laughed. Not the controlled social laugh I had heard him produce at dinners across 30 years, the managed expression of a man performing the function of amusement for an audience. The surprised, real kind. The kind that doesn't plan itself or adjust its own volume or arrange its own timing. The kind that arrives because something has been so completely and unexpectedly accurate. So exactly the right thing said in exactly the right way at exactly the right moment, that the only possible response is the involuntary one. She had known then, she said, that she was safe. Not safe from any particular thing. Not protected from difficulty or shielded from what the world was. Simply that sort of safe, the safe that means you are exactly where you are supposed to be with exactly the right person, and you know it, and the knowing of it is not frightening, it is simply accurate, and it is very good to have something accurate. He had held out his hand after that, and she had taken it. The formal proceedings took 3 weeks. Miriam's father's estate was in the end not without value. The fraudulent administration had concealed a modest but real inheritance, assets she held clear title to once the deed of administration was properly set aside. She received this news with the equanimity of someone who had not allowed themselves to depend on any particular outcome. She would have been entirely all right without it. But it was hers, and having it was a dignity, and she accepted it as the accurate thing that it was. They were married in the spring, in the chapel at Dawnmere Hall, with the household, myself and my wife, Dawnmere's sister and her husband, and one elderly maternal aunt of Miriam's who arrived from the north and spent the ceremony weeping with happiness, which was the only extravagant emotion on display, everyone else having decided by unspoken mutual agreement that the occasion called for something quieter than it was large. The chapel was full of early light and the smell of the new season, and the windows were clear, and the whole of it had the quality of a thing that is exactly the right size for what it is. Dawnmere's sister, who is a very sensible woman and had arrived the previous day with the expressed purpose of forming a view, had taken me aside the evening before and told me that she thought Miriam was the best thing that had happened to her brother in 36 years, possibly including the dukedom, and that she had recognized this within the first quarter of an hour of making her acquaintance, and that she could not understand what had taken Crispin so long. I told her that 6 weeks was not especially long, considering. She said that was a reasonable point and that she would give him credit for it. I stood near the front and watched them at the altar. Dawnmere had the expression of a man at the precise intersection of calm and completely undone, which was a combination I had never seen on his face before and which was, I thought, the most honest expression I had ever seen him wear. He looked at her the way he looked at everything he took seriously, with complete, undivided attention, except that this time the attention had something underneath it that was nothing like the attention he brought to documents or disputes or the management of the estate. This was the attention of a man who cannot quite believe his luck and is determined not to look away in case it changes. Miriam looked at him with her customary composure, and also with something warm in her face that was not performed and not contained, and that I believe she was not trying to contain. She had, I think, made her decision in November in the garden and had not needed to revise it since, and the certainty of a decision already made gave her the freedom to simply be where she was, fully and without reservation. The ceremony was brief and well conducted, and the minister did not overextend himself, for which everyone was grateful. I stood near the front and watched them at the altar, and what I was watching was not primarily a ceremony. It was the completion of something that had begun in a room full of people who had treated a woman as a transaction, when a man at the back of that room had recognized something the room had failed to recognize, and had stepped forward in the only language such rooms understand. Afterward, when the table was loud enough for private conversation, Dawnmere came and stood beside me and said low, "Well." "Well," I agreed. "I understand you are not the sort of friend who says, 'I told you so.'" "I am absolutely that sort of friend," I said. "I have simply been exercising extraordinary restraint for several months." He looked at her across the table. She was speaking to my wife with the frank, interested attention she brought to everything, and she glanced up, found his gaze, and held it for a moment with an expression entirely private and entirely between them. Not the composure of the exchange, not the steady measurement of a woman assessing a situation, but something warmer and more unguarded, a look that said, quietly and without performance, that she knew exactly where she was and was entirely at ease with it. He said nothing after that for a while, neither did I. His sister found me later after the table had thinned and the candles were lower and said, "He looks different." She studied him across the room. "He looks like himself. He has not looked like himself in a very long time." I had rather stopped thinking he would. She sipped her wine. "She did that. She looked at him until she found what was actually there, and then she stayed for it. That's rather rare. That's actually rather rare." She set down her glass and went to find her husband, and I thought about what she had said for a long time. Later he told me what she had said in the days before the wedding, when they were going over the settlement documents together. She had insisted on going through the settlement documents together, which had apparently astonished his solicitors, and had not astonished him at all. She had said that the thing she valued most, looking back over the months since the exchange, was that he had never, after that first day, tried to arrange things for her without asking her first. He had made a habit of it, so consistent and so natural that she had stopped noticing it as a choice, and had come to understand it as the way he operated, the specific manner in which he made clear, without saying it outright, what he thought of the person he was working alongside. She had said that in all the years of her life before Dawnmere Hall, she had not been accustomed to being consulted. She had not expected to miss it, because you cannot miss a thing you have not been given. But she missed it, she said, the moment she had it, the way you miss a warm room the moment you step back into the cold. He had told her he intended to go on doing it, that he had found it considerably more interesting to consult someone than to act on their behalf, and that he intended to consult her about the estate, the household, the correspondence, the investments, and anything else that presented itself, and that she was welcome to disagree with him as often as seemed accurate, which he anticipated would be regularly. She had said he would come to regret that invitation. He had said he did not think so. "Will you?" I asked him that evening. "Not for a single moment of my life," he said, with the simple conviction of a man who has come rather late to a certainty that other men reach earlier and sometimes lose. He was still looking at her across the room. She was laughing at something his sister had said, a real laugh, unself-conscious and warm, and he was watching it the way a man watches something he has been given that he knows the value of. Not for a single moment. My son, when I told him all of this on the night before he went north, asked me what I thought was the center of it, the moment when everything had changed into what it became, the precise point at which one thing had finished and a different thing had started. I thought about this for a long time, because I have been thinking about it in one form or another for years, and I have never quite been able to give it the tidy answer that a moment is supposed to have. I told him I thought there were two moments, not one, and that they were not entirely separate things but the same thing viewed from different angles, like looking at a building from two ends of the same street. What you see depends on where you are standing. The building is the same building. The first was in the exchange, when the gavel came down and Miriam Voss turned and looked at Crispin Aldred across a room full of people who had just treated her as a transaction. And she looked at him not with gratitude or relief or the practiced appeal for approval that such rooms expect and reward, but with the clear, unhurried, measuring gaze of a person who was deciding for herself what the situation actually was and what she intended to make of it. She was not, in that moment, a woman who had just been saved. She was a woman who was in the process of assessing the person who had just stepped into her situation, and the assessment had not yet been completed, and she was not going to behave as if it had. That was the moment he understood, whether he understood it consciously or not in that room, that she was not a woman in need of a patron. She was a woman in full possession of herself who had been placed in an impossible situation and who was going to navigate it on her own terms, and the only question was whether he was going to prove worth including in those terms. The second was in the garden, on a November morning 15 days later, when he held out his hand with the particular uncertainty of a man who is offering something genuine and is genuinely uncertain whether it will be received, and is willing to be uncertain, and is not hiding the uncertainty. And she looked at the hand for a moment and looked at the man who was offering it and put her hand in his. That was the moment they stopped being an arrangement and became what they were, what they have been in the 23 years since, without deviation. My son asked which one mattered more. I told him they were the same moment, viewed from either end of the same street. In the exchange, she had begun her assessment of him. In the garden, she had completed it, and the result of the assessment was that she chose him, clearly, in full possession of all available information, without being asked to, for reasons that were entirely her own. And he in the garden had chosen her, not the way he had chosen in the exchange, from the back of the room in a language of price and authority, but the way you choose when you have nothing to deploy except the simple, undefended truth of what you want, and you hold your hand out and you wait. The choosing in both directions was the thing. The specific, particular, fully considered choosing of the other person, not because you are required to, not because it is convenient, not because the situation has arranged itself in a way that makes it the obvious next step, but because you have looked at the whole of them accurately with open eyes, and you prefer them, and you intend to go on preferring them. My son went north the next morning. I believe he thought about it on the road. I still do. 23 years on, I still come back to it. I come back to the girl in the gray gown in the center of that room, deciding that what was happening to her was not a measure of what she was. I come back to the man at the back of the room, recognizing something the room had failed to recognize. I come back to the window in the library and the south walk, and two people going on together in the November light with her hand in his. I have told this story 3 times. I believe I will tell it again if I am given the occasion. There are not many stories I would tell 3 times. This is one of them. It is one of them because it is true, And because what it is true about is worth saying more than once, which is this: that the one worth wanting is not always the one the room has decided is worth wanting, and that the man who steps forward in the language of that particular room and is willing, afterward, to hold out his hand in a different language entirely, with nothing in it but the uncertainty of a man who cares what happens next. That man is, whatever else he may be, exactly the right man for the right woman, if the right woman decides to take his hand. She decided, she took it, the rest was theirs. And it was, by any measure I have ever had the patience to apply to such things, more than enough.